Did Pope Pius XII collaborate with Adolf Hitler? Was Pope Pius XII an anti-Semite? In an extensive interview with John Cornwell, author of the year's most controversial book, Hitler's Pope, we find out that the answer is yes. Now, for decades, there have been allegations about how Eugenio Pacelli, better known as Pope Pius XII, collaborated with the Nazis before and during World War II. Of course, the Vatican has always denied these charges, but they've kept their records locked up. They haven't allowed scholars to truly investigate the relationship between Pope Pius XII and Adolf Hitler. Well, all that changed 7 years ago when Cambridge University historian John Cornwell was given access to the secret Vatican archives. Now, Cornwell was a good Catholic. He'd written a best-selling book about the death of Pope John Paul I, and the Vatican fully expected him to exonerate Pius XII. Indeed, Cornwell himself hoped that the rumors about Nazi collusion were untrue. But to his horror, he found the opposite. Document after document proved that Eugenio Pacelli, the man who became Pope in 1939, stands as a monumental moral failure. A man more concerned with centralizing church authority than with the murder of millions of people. A man not only complicit with the rise of the Nazi Party, but according to Cornwell, a man whose silence about the fate of the Jews betrayed a deeply embedded anti-Semitic attitude. Now, Cornwell put all this in his controversial new book, Hitler's Pope, The Secret History of Pius XII. And naturally, the Roman Catholic Church has strongly denied the claims of anti-Semitism, and some have even criticized Cornwell's scholarship. Well, I spoke to Cornwell recently and began by asking him about Pacelli's work in the 1930s in Germany, where he negotiated the now infamous treaty between the Vatican and Hitler's regime.
Well, first of all, why did he go to Germany? Why was he sent there? And the reason is the instrument, the effective instrument of creating an ideology out of the whole idea of papal primacy was this new drafting of a code of canon law. For the first time in the Church's history, we had a code of canon law. But they had a problem, and that problem was Germany, because Germany had one of the largest Catholic populations in the world, 23 million. It was wealthy, complex, highly sophisticated, many Catholic universities, publishing houses, 400 Catholic newspapers, and a really effective democratic political party called the Centre Party. So his purpose in Germany was to renegotiate all these old treaties and bring them in line with the new code, which effectively would submit the German Catholic population to a new allegiance to the Holy See. Year after year, he attempted to pursue this concordat, the Reichskonkordat, and he was turned down by successive chancellors, 5 of whom were Catholics, because they thought that the Vatican attempts were too authoritarian. It wasn't until Hitler emerged in power in January of 1933 that the chance for these two supreme authoritarians to come together and to do a deal came about.
Now, why would a pope make that deal? Why would they withdraw Catholics from the political field?
Pacelli, even before he became pope in relation to Germany, did not trust Catholic democracy. They did not like Catholic parties because they couldn't control them and because they thought that it might introduce democratization by the back door into the church itself.
And what were they afraid of? Why was democracy such a thing to fear for the church?
Well, they thought that it was uncontrollable, that's the first thing. But secondly, they really did view democracy as a precursor to socialism, which of course was a precursor to communism.
Once the Concordat is signed, Hitler is joyous, but so is Pacelli. Both think they've won. Was Pacelli simply fooled by Hitler, that Hitler had essentially emasculated the church and then he could have his way with Germany under the so-called protection of the church? Was Pacelli simply fooled and out-negotiated by Adolf Hitler, or was he more actively in collusion, knowing Hitler's agenda at that time?
Hitler, in his very first public statement after the Concordat, said that this shows that the Vatican believes that it can live comfortably with fascism.
That it almost blesses the fascist project.
That's right, both at home and abroad. So it will lull Catholics into thinking that, you know, there is no problem whatsoever with National Socialism, and it will show the world that National Socialism is respectable. Now, it's interesting that Pacelli was immediately outraged by this. And that does indicate, you know, he had no great love of Hitler, no great love of National Socialism, but he was prepared to do deals with the devil in the interests of what he saw to be the best interest of the Catholic Church, which was this centralization. His great statement immediately after Hitler's, he states quite clearly that the triumph is actually the Church's, because what the Concordat means is the acknowledgement by the German state of the right of the Holy See to impose canon law on all German Catholics. So there we see, you know, these remarkable goals which are quite different, but which have disastrous consequences for the history of the rest of this decade. We see this powerful Catholic Church withdrawing from all social and political action, which includes the voluntary disbanding of the Centre Party after having voted for the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler his dictatorship. That was all part of the deal. We can now see, as we tell the narrative, I believe for the first time in a general work of history, that the price of this Concordat, the price of this deal, was that the Catholic Centre Party, under the encouragement of Pacelli, should vote Hitler into his dictatorship and then voluntarily disband itself with the blessing of the Holy See, the Vatican, which is why so many Catholics after this, because they had no political home to go, went in their hundreds of thousands into the Nazi Party.
Was Pacelli simply blind to the consequences of making a deal with Hitler? Or, more horrifyingly, did he care what the consequences were for non-Catholics?
Well, I think he had an extraordinary ability to blind himself to the consequences of his actions all the way through his life. It's interesting that although immediately after the Concordat he said it was a great triumph for the imposition of the Code of Canon Law on German Catholics, he actually changed his tune later on. He said that he was forced into the Concordat with a gun to his head, and that it was some kind of legal agreement was better than none. This shows extraordinary capacity for self-delusion, I think, and we see this actually all through his life.
Now, one of the claims in this book is that he's actively anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. He wrote the following passage during his time in Munich when he witnessed the Bolshevik uprising. Now, the Bolshevik uprising, just to remind people, many of the leaders were Jewish. And he wrote about seeing these Jews things like this. An army of employees were dashing to and fro, giving out orders. And in the midst of all this, a gang of young women of dubious appearance, Jews like all the rest of them, hanging around in the offices with lecherous demeanor and suggestive smiles. Throughout it, he calls them pale, dirty, drugged eyes, vulgar, repulsive, with faces that are intelligent and sly. Stereotypical anti-Semitic contempt, as you call it.
Yes.
Did this run through his whole life? Did he view Jews like that?
No, it's the only evidence I've found of that kind of moral and physical disdain for Jewish people. But people will take this in different ways. I've been told by prominent Catholic journalists that my interpretation of this as anti-Semitic is bizarre. I have to say that the immediate parallel I found with this kind of language is actually in Mein Kampf, talking of the same group of people and during the same period of time between 1919 and 1920. We have absolutely no doubt when we teach in history class and refer to Mein Kampf as a text that this is typical of anti-Semitic attitudes.
Now, Eugenio Pacelli becomes Pope on the eve of World War II. He's essentially spent much of the last decade negotiating this Concordat with Nazi Germany throughout the 30s. And people know by the early 40s what Hitler's up to. And yet throughout the war, Pope Pius XII never speaks out against the Nazis, about the killing of the Jews, the Gypsies, the Poles. Why was he silent?
Well, it's interesting that the view of Pius XII, the common view before my book, is that he was the silent Pope and that this was the great scandal. In fact, it's a pity he wasn't completely silent, because the fact is that he did speak out. He spoke out at Christmas 1942, and this was after 6 months of systematic information coming into the Vatican about the true extent of the final solution. I mean, in July 1942, for example, it was published in the Daily Telegraph in London and the New York Times that millions of Jews were going to their deaths. All these details were known. And it's known, too, that diplomats inside the Vatican were supplying him with whole dossiers of information. And in the autumn of 1942, President Roosevelt actually sent an envoy through enemy territory, a man called Myron Taylor, to plead with him to speak out. So finally he speaks, Christmas 1942. And what does he say? Instead of telling the true figures, the millions that were going to their deaths, he scales it down to hundreds of thousands. He doesn't mention the word Jews.
In fact, he says here, I shall read it. He says, in this, what became known as his most clear denunciation, he says, "Humanity owes this vow to those hundreds of thousands who, without any fault of their own, sometimes only by reason of their nationality or race, are marked down for death or gradual extinction."
That's right. And
that's all he said throughout the war.
That is the fullest extent of all his statements during the war. And it is clear to me that is it is a statement. He's saying something. He's not being silent. But the statement is tantamount to being a denial of the truth, and certainly a trivialization of the true horror of the final solution. In this sense, what he said was deeply scandalous, and particularly scandalous to all those German Catholics who might have been moved by what he said, instead of which their consciences were placated and lulled.
Peter Gumpel again says, "In my considered opinion, a public protest by the Pope would not have saved a single Jewish life. It would have only aggravated the persecution of both the Jews and the Catholics. It was a strategy, therefore, a considered strategy of this Pope to remain totally silent throughout the war." Again, is that disingenuous?
I think it's disingenuous because it should have been explained to us after the war that this is what he was doing. What did he say in 1946 before a group of Arabs visiting the Vatican? He boasted that he had spoken out clearly against the Nazis for their treatment of the Jews, when we know that that was simply not true.
So he lied?
Well, what we certainly know is that he took credit for things he didn't do, which means that he's a hypocrite as well.
Why is he being beatified then?
Well, the process of beatification and canonization, the making of saints, has become, during the reign of this Pope, extremely political.
We're talking about John Paul now.
We're talking about John Paul II. What would be the politics behind the beatification of Pius XII? It would be surely that his policies of extreme centralization, his policies of absolutism, his conduct during the war would be exonerated, not only exonerated, but actually confirmed.
Knowing about this, and you're a Catholic, does this shake your faith? Does this change your attitudes as a Catholic towards the institution of the Catholic Church?
Well, I don't regard myself as a particularly good Catholic. I go to church. But, you know, there have been bad popes in the past, and there'll be bad popes in the future. And what we're learning from, I hope, one of the lessons that I've certainly carried away from my journey through the life and career of Pius XII is that, you know, the Catholic Church is not the Pope. The Catholic Church is to be found in all the people of God and not just concentrated in this one man.
John Cornwell's book, Hitler's Pope, is a well-researched and a thorough chronicle of the shameful, the deceitful acts of a pope who has, up to this point, been very well protected by church apologists. Now, the first half of the book is a bit dense. It focuses on church history before Pacelli's reign as pope. But this second half of Cornwell's book is nothing short of a harrowing read. Now, it obviously gave Cornwell no pleasure to expose the Pope Pius XII as a moral failure and as an anti-Semite, but to his credit, he does it without backing away. I would put this book on your must-read list. This is history at its best: investigative, explosive, and finally revelatory.